Okay, everyone. Welcome to test review day. I have no prepared remarks. The time is entirely yours. However many questions there are, up to the end of class, that's how long the class will last. So, are there any questions about any of the material? Yeah.
Can you go over psychological versus ethical egoism again?
Good. So the written question that I mentioned on last class will be about psychological egoism, not ethical egoism. But ethical egoism means it is morally right to do what is selfish. It's an ethical theory. Always struck me as a kind of goofy one. I mean, not maybe I don't know if you've ever heard of Ayn Rand. Any of you heard of Ayn Rand? So she's an ethical egoist. She thinks that the morally right thing to do is whatever is selfish. Psychological egoism is an empirical claim that all human motivation is ultimately selfish. Other questions? Yep.
So just about that, for ethical egoism then, you wouldn't be able to disprove it with just the same disproof. It would be completely
No, it would be different, yeah.
And that's because it's prescriptive, not descriptive.
Exactly. Yeah. Ethical egoism is a prescriptive claim. So you can't do studies to disprove ethical egoism. Yeah.
So I just have a couple questions about the Trivers article.
Yep.
So one of the key terms was complex regulating system. I was wondering if you could go over that.
Yeah, for sure. So basically all that means is in order for reciprocal altruism to evolve, it requires a certain amount of intelligence. You have to be able to keep track of certain things, regulate certain responses. I forget the exact definition he gives, but actually I can go ahead and say that one won't be on the test. Merry Christmas.
Okay, sounds good. And sorry, just to follow up on that
Yep.
as well. So when it's one of the terms altruism, Trivers' definition, that would just be reciprocal altruism?
Okay,
Or-
no, so his definition of altruism, so reciprocal altruism is his theory of how it evolved.
Okay.
His definition of it, if I remember correctly, is he actually defines it so that it's directed towards non-kin. So it's a behavior that in the short term is costly to the organism and benefits another organism that is not related to it. And then and we know that happens sometimes, like in humans and other species, and the paper is, how could that evolve? And reciprocal altruism is his explanation of how that evolves.
Okay, sounds good. And sorry, just a couple
Nope,
more for
yeah, go
that
ahead, yeah.
Trivers paper. A couple of the terms were also sympathy and guilt. So I was wondering if we could go over that. I know we talked about friendship and gratitude, but
Yeah, so for guilt, the idea would, sympathy, the explanation is going to be similar to the other ones where, feeling bad for someone will motivate you to help them, and helping can have the kinds of benefits we talked about. Guilt, as an emotion, serves the following function. If someone catches me not reciprocating or breaking the fairness rules, I feel bad and am motivated to fix it. And that's what happens, right? When someone catches you doing something wrong or you feel bad, you want to amend the friendship or amend the relationship by doing something good. So that's the function that it serves.
thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
From the Grossman article,
Yeah.
can you go over the first order and second order inequality?
Good. So first order inequality aversion would be like the monkey video we saw. So that's when there's inequality, there's unfair treatment or unfair payment. So one gets the grape, one gets the cucumber. And in the video, the cucumber receiver, which is the lesser payment, is angry about it in some way. Second order inequality aversion is when the monkey or the organism that's getting the better treatment is unhappy about it in some way, or at least engages in behaviors to equalize. So think of it like first person, second person. First order is on behalf of yourself, like you are the one being screwed. Second order is you're doing something on behalf of someone else who's being screwed. Yeah.
I don't remember which article it is, I just have it written. It's the one where they talk about the liberal and conservative differences. The one term was about operationalizing foundations in terms of amount required to violate taboos.
Yeah, good. So that's in the appendix of the article on the 5 foundations. So how do you measure how much people care about these different foundations? The simplest way, which you can all do yourselves on yourmorals.org, is you just give a questionnaire. How much do you care about these different things? You have different questions that tap into the different 5 foundations. The term you listed relates to the appendix, where there's a list of actions that would violate the different foundations. I think the example I gave was, well, here, I'll open it up and I'll see if there's some fun ones. But the one I remember giving, because some of you kind of chuckled at it, was how much would you have to be paid to slap your father in the face if it was part of a skit? So that one is supposed to violate the authority foundation. So like for purity, oh, that's interesting. Get a blood transfusion of disease-free blood from a child molester. So it's like, you're not hurting yourself or anything else, but it just seems like, no, that just seems wrong. So there's various examples like that. And the question is, how much would you have to be paid to violate the different norms? And the more you'd have to be paid, the more you care about those foundations. Yep.
Can you quickly go over the Batson arguments against egoism again?
So for Batson, they aren't conceptual arguments, it's like studies. And you could use those studies for the question. So one of them was, you vary how easy it is to escape from watching the person suffer. And the idea there is, if people are altruistic just to avoid suffering, just to avoid their own unpleasant feelings, that should make them less altruistic. And he found that it didn't, whereas manipulations that increase empathy do make them more likely to help. Whereas and then I think the other one was, he tells them, okay, you're going to see a happy video at the end in the experimental condition, and the control condition they don't. And again, if being nice to people is just a way of making yourself feel better, then they should be less nice if they know they're going to see a happy video after. That'll take care of it. But again, that manipulation had no effect. Other questions? Yep.
Can we go over the is-ought gap again?
Yep, for sure. Actually, someone asked a good question about this. So the is-ought gap is this. You cannot logically move from an is statement to an ought statement. Is, you could also say descriptive, so some kind of factual statement. Things are like this. You can't move from a description of how things are to a description of how they ought to be, or how they should be. Someone emailed me, I think their example was, animals eat, or animals engage in eating other animals. Humans are animals, therefore humans should eat animals, or it's morally good for humans to eat animals. That doesn't logically follow. You can't logically move from a description of how the world works to a description of how it should be. So yeah, does that help?
A little bit.
I could say more. So one way of spelling this out is by remembering how deduction works. So deductive logic, this is the same example I gave, but all men are mortal. This is the famous example. To Socrates is a man. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. So if you're going to, so in this case, the conclusion logically follows from the premises, meaning the two premises guarantee that the conclusion is true. So that makes sense.
Yeah, so those are all what you would consider is statements.
Yes, although that doesn't matter for, all that I'm trying to show with this is that deductive logic works like this. The premises have to show for sure that the conclusion is true. Yes, in this case, they're all is statements, but the crucial point here is for deductive logic to work, the premises have to guarantee that the conclusion is true. And what the is-ought gap says, if you only have is statements here, you can't have an ought in here. Or anything like that, a moral statement, a should statement, anything like that. In order to have moral, immoral, should, ought. In the conclusion, it has to show up in the premises. If it doesn't show up in the premises, then the argument is logically invalid. Yeah. And while I wait for another hand, one point though that the book makes is, this doesn't mean that is statements are irrelevant. You still can include them in an argument for a moral conclusion. It's just that somewhere in the premises there has to be a should or a moral assumption or a moral premise. Yeah.
May you please go over Feinberg's analytic statements versus synthetic statements?
I think I mentioned in class that those won't be on the test.
Oh.
But it's the same thing as what the book calls, I think, or very similar to the distinction the book makes between conceptual statements and empirical statements. Empirical is a bit more narrow than synthetic, but I wouldn't worry about that. I don't feel like giving extra headaches.
Can you go to reflective equilibrium?
Yep, for sure. So we start off with intuitive judgments. We have various moral intuitions given to us by some combination of our evolved human nature and our culture. Right? We have these intuitions that certain things are wrong. But these intuitions are somewhat in conflict with each other, or my intuitions might be different from your intuitions, so we need some way of adjudicating differences or disagreements. The process of arriving at reflective equilibrium works like this. So you have your, I'm going to say, intuitive judgments. And these are usually specific. They're not broad things. It's like, stealing is wrong, rape is wrong, throwing your favorite actions here, right? Things that we intuitively feel are wrong. What we do is we posit moral principles, which are more abstract, and we posit principles that account for our different judgments. So when I say account for, I mean, if this principle is right, it implies that these intuitive judgments are right. So an example someone gave during the discussion was something like, violence is bad. That's, a broad principle. And that explains our, intuition that assault and murder, etc., are wrong. But the principle might be in conflict with another judgment, like the judgment that self-defense is justified. Most people feel intuitively that, look, if someone attacks you and you fight back, that's not morally wrong. Okay, so then we have to modify the principle. I think the group said something like, unprovoked violence is bad. And then, okay, now it's consistent with this judgment. So the correction can go from a judgment to a principle where the judgment we hold, especially if it's one we're very sure of, we can use it to correct or amend a principle. But the correction can also go the other way. If a principle is very well established, in that it explains a lot of our judgments, we can use it to say, this judgment here that we were kind of unsure of, we're actually just going to forget about that judgment. And so what the term reflective equilibrium means is it's a state where the principles and the judgments are consistent. You can, upon reflection, say, yes, I accept my principles and my judgments, after going through this back and forth.
So realistically, would you say that true reflective equilibrium is possible? Or is there always an exception to any principle?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I would be very hesitant to say that it's impossible, but it's definitely difficult to achieve. And there are different ways. So one way of achieving it, and this is what a lot of utilitarians do, is you just reject a lot of the intuitive judgments. So utilitarianism has a lot of counterintuitive implications, like torture is sometimes okay, like pushing the large men in front of the trolley is okay. And one thing you can do is say, well, I like the principles, I'm just going to reject a lot of the judgments. And then you'll have reflective equilibrium, but it's somewhat costly. Another thing you can do is just have lots of principles. But then that's tough because then they start to conflict with each other if you have too many, and then you run into a different problem. So I won't say it's impossible, but there are some of the ways of getting it are costly, I guess is one thing I can say.
Can you go over null hypothesis significance testing
Yep.
and the p-value as well?
Yep. So the null hypothesis is the hypothesis you want to reject. So it's, my prof would call it the hypothesis to be nullified. It is typically, and in psychology it's almost always, the hypothesis that there is no effect or no correlation. Like the effect or correlation is zero. So suppose you're looking for, in my example, well, correlation may be hard to explain. I'll stick with the one I used earlier, which was a sex difference. So if you're looking for a sex difference in, let's say, utilitarian judgment, which some studies have looked at, there's some studies finding males are on average more utilitarian. The null hypothesis would be, in the population, the sex difference in utilitarian judgment is zero. They're equally utilitarian. So, whatever it is. Let's say there's a utilitarian scale from 1 to 7, the average score is 3.5 in both. So we don't know if that's true or not, but that would be an example of a null hypothesis. The difference is zero. So we can't study the whole population, that's too hard. So we get a sample of 100 men and 100 women, and let's say we find that males, their utilitarian score is 5.6, and females, their utilitarianism score is 2.1. So the p-value is the probability of getting your result if the null is true. So if there's no difference between males and females in the population, so we don't know if that's, but if there was no difference, what are the chances we would get a difference this big? And intuitively it should look like, that looks pretty unlikely. Pretty unlikely we get a difference that big if in the population there's no difference. So in that case, the p-value will be small. Unlikely we would get a difference that big if there's no sex difference. So you have to know more information to calculate it, but whatever, 0.001 or something. It would be very small. So the smaller the p-value is, the better. Null hypothesis significance testing involves setting a cutoff, which is usually 0.05, and we just say if the p-value is less than this, then we conclude there's a real effect, at least tentatively. We say that we have a statistically significant result. Kind of arbitrary. There's not really any deep reason in the book of nature that we didn't pick 0.06 or 0.04. In fact, some people argue it should be lower, but it's a kind of convention that sciences like psychology and biology use. I think you asked it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yep, I think your hand's up first.
Could you go over the pain example from chapter 3 again?
Yeah, so that was, if I remember correctly, although any questions about this, were there any follow-ups about that? Just because this is, it'll come up in your other classes too.
Can you give an example of where we just go, that intuitive judgment, it doesn't matter?
Yeah, so
How
the
do
one
we
I gave in,
just, deny an intuitive judgment?
yeah, the one, it's harder to think about with this one, but the one I gave in class was, suppose the principle you've arrived at is causing harm is wrong unless it prevents a greater amount of future harm. So you've gone back and forth with the judgments and arrived at that. Then you look at a case like torture, which intuitively feels wrong. You say, well, we have this principle though, it's pretty good, so we're gonna say torture is okay if it's preventing a bomb from going off in a building or something. So I'm not saying that's right or wrong, I'm saying that would be an example of using a principle to override a judgment. Okay, any questions on this before I erase it? None of the hands are about that. And then your question was about pain, right?
Yeah.
So I brought that up in the context of the distinction between the content of a mental state and the function of a mental state. Content relates to a term I added, which was proximate explanation. and function relates to evolutionary, or sometimes called ultimate explanation, which is different from ultimate desire, but I'll just use evolutionary because then it keeps it simple. So in the case of pain, so I put my hand on the stove, I feel pain, I pull away. And I don't touch the stove again. I form the association, don't touch the stove again. And then you ask me, why did you stop touching the stove? At the level of content, it's going to be, well, because it bloody well hurt. And I don't like that. That sucks. And that's proximate explanation. The proximate explanation is about what's immediately going on in my head when I, do something. Or it could be environmental causes impinging on my brain. So the content of my mental state is, that hurts, I don't want to do that again. The functional explanation or evolutionary explanation would be, why do humans act that way at all? Why is it that following bodily damage, we avoid doing that thing? And you may say, well, that's just obvious, but there's no contradiction in imagining a being that, you could just, comedic figures in cartoons like this, who every time they get hurt, they laugh and do it over and over again until they die. Like, you could imagine, it'd be easy to make a robot like that. You can imagine maybe a sadistic, Greek god or something like Zeus making a being, that had that design. So why don't we have that design? That's what a functional explanation answers, and it's pretty easy to figure out, right? In evolutionary terms, any being with genes that made it, repeatedly return to the pain-causing entity, they didn't pass on their genes. So pain is just an illustration of why these two are different things. And I guess I should add, they're different in the sense that both of these are true, but they're not the same thing. When I pull my hand away from the stove, I'm not thinking in my head. I'm pulling away so that my body will survive long enough for me to reproduce, even though that's the function.
So, talking about kin selection, is that used as a counter-argument against psychological egoism?
It could be, yeah. I don't know if I mentioned it as well, but it certainly could be. So kin selection says that traits or genes which produce traits that make you nice to your relatives can get selected for, because your relatives share your genes. The clearest case of kin selection is parent-child investment. Why does parent-child investment exist? Well, again, you have genes which made people more likely to love their kids, or more likely to get passed on. Genes that make you like eating your kids or something. I mean, there's weird species in which you can find exceptions, but generally speaking, those genes don't get passed on. This relates to this. So at the level of function, the reason that be nice to your kid tendencies exist is they help facilitate the transmission of genes. But at the level of content, people are not thinking selfishly when they love their kids. They're not thinking, yes, this is for my genes to get passed on. They're thinking, oh, I just love my kid. And many parents say, and many parents do say, I would, jump in front of a train for my kid. So at a psychological level, it's a good example of non-egoistic motivation, even though the evolutionary function is, quote, selfish from the gene's eye view, just not from the individual psychology point of view. Yes?
So then, is there a response from psychological egoism that is essentially saying, yes, at the proximate level, it is still egoistic because, you're having these feelings that you should do things, and so you're doing the things because of your own selfish feelings? I think that was talked about in the Feinberg paper.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Sorry, is the argument, is that a valid counter argument, or does that fall prey to basically a definition?
Yeah, I think it would be a definition problem. So if the egoist comes back and says, yes, at the level of psychology, we're not always selfishly motivated, but from the gene's eye view, things are designed to perpetuate the genes, I would say that's almost certainly true, but then it's not very interesting. That's just standard evolutionary biology, that genes that increase their own chances of getting spread tend to increase in frequency over time. That's true, but it's psychological egoism, not gene replication egoism. It's saying that our motivations are selfish. So I think that would be the right way to think about that. But it's a good question because it helps to reinforce this distinction. Yep.
If in the key terms you've listed just like a name, like Aristotle or Daniel Madison, what are you looking for in the definition?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of. Okay, I can say this. I know for sure for test 1, there's not a name as a. It's possible in a future one. I have to double. I've made all the tests already, but if there was one on a future test, maybe just like their basic views on a question. I mean, some of the terms, to be honest, I have listed more so to guide what you focus on as you read. I think names would probably fall in that category. Like, I think they're definitely not on test 1. I don't think they're on the other ones either.
Okay, thank you.
For the test, do we need to know like what information comes from like what article?
No. It could be good to say for the written questions, like you were saying, like so and so argued this.
Okay.
But yeah, for like the definitions, no, just say what they mean. Yeah. Yep.
Could you explain Kant's stance on morality, and like, could you like delve into like who being agrees and who would go against that?
So you don't need to know who agrees with it or who goes against it right now. Well, I guess Colbert kind of does. We're spending more time on Kant in a future chapter, but yeah, the basic idea. So Immanuel Kant, probably, if you ask most people, oh yeah, right, the blue one sucks, I forgot, or black one. If you polled philosophers and asked who's the most important philosopher of the last 400 years, most would probably say Immanuel Kant. He didn't just write about ethics, he wrote a lot of other really important work. He didn't use this term, but his ethical theories come to be known as deontology. Deon being derived from, I think, a Greek word having to do with duty or something like that. So here's the way it works. Kant thinks that you can derive what's moral purely from reason. This is one way in which it's different from consequentialism or utilitarianism, where if you want to know what's right, you have to see what the effects are of actions. Does it cause suffering or happiness? But for Kant, no, you can just sit in your armchair, close your eyes, and think about what's right or wrong and figure out the true answer. The way that you do it is by putting forward different candidate maxims or principles and seeing if they entail a contradiction. If a maxim or principle entails a contradiction, then you shouldn't accept it. Now, I don't believe any of this actually works, but as an example of what he thought counted as a contradiction, take the principle, so suppose we're talking about honesty. This is like the example that's always in the textbooks. One candidate maxim would be always lie. And what Kant says is no one could consistently will that. No one could wish that everyone lied all the time without contradicting themselves. Therefore, we should reject that maxim and go with always tell the truth. So that's an example. So you can sit down, think about whether candidate moral principles entail a contradiction. If they do, reject them. And so the principles he arrived at were things like, yeah, always tell the truth. Another one he arrived at, and don't ask me to spell out how this entails a contradiction, I don't remember. But one principle is never use people as a mere means to an end. You should always treat people as ends in themselves. This is why Kantians usually say it's wrong to push the person in front of the trolley, because you're using them as a trolley stopper. Do you have a follow-up?
No, that's it, thank you.
Okay. Apparently he never left his hometown. Other questions? Yep.
Just to go back to the foundations, I
Yep.
was wondering about in-group loyalty. It says based on coalitional psychology. Does that have to do with like tribal relations? Or-
Yes.
Okay.
The idea is, at least Haidt's idea is that we evolve, and this is different from group selection, although I guess Haidt believes in group selection, but it doesn't commit you to believing in group selection. But yeah, Haidt thinks we evolved in a context of tribal warfare. And in order to be good at tribal warfare, you have to be able to form bonds with other people and kind of like your in-group, not like the out-group. So yeah, that's the idea of how that one emerged. I saw another hand, yeah.
Could you go over cultural evolution again?
Yep, so as I said, cultural evolution is something that everyone agrees exists. The term cultural evolution I'm defining very broadly, just the fact that cultures change over time. And again, no one who knows even a tiny bit of history would deny that that happens. The specific mechanism that's sometimes posited to explain it is memes. This is more controversial. The idea here is we can study cultural evolution by looking at the units of cultural evolution, which are ideas and behavior patterns, or memes. This is not memes in the internet sense, although internet memes would count as memes in this broad sense. But anything that can be passed on from human to human via imitation will count as a meme. And the idea is it's supposed to be analogous to how genes work in biological evolution, where in biological evolution, genes which are more suited to the environment, or which produce traits that are more suited to the environment, those genes will increase in frequency over time. And the same thing is true with memes. Some memes are going to be better at getting themselves passed on. So this is just, you don't have to know this, but one example is, some ideas are more memorable. There's been some interesting work looking at how counterintuitive an idea is. And so you can have a range, right? Really counterintuitive to not at all counterintuitive. And if you tell people stories, and you assign people to different conditions. So in one condition, nothing's counterintuitive. The story is, Bob went to the store, he bought a tomato, and it was good, or whatever. So nothing strange happens. Minimally counterintuitive is you throw in a few unexpected things, maybe a few miracles, a few surprising turns, or whatever. And then over here, an event that's completely wild. Like every law of physics is broken, people behave in ways that doesn't make sense. And what you find is the stories that are most memorable are the ones in the middle. Like a few unexpected turns, but not so crazy you can't keep track of anything. And some have argued that that could be a kind of, that the kinds of cultural stories we tend to have are the ones that are the most spreadable, that are kind of minimally counterintuitive. So that's probably more than you needed, but. Yep.
In chapter 1, under the key terms, there was one that said like the analogy of science. Could you go over that?
Yeah, so it relates to reflective. I think there was a question on E-class about this, but so, and don't put too much pressure on this analogy. Well, maybe if you're a moral realist, you could put more pressure. The analogy would work better, but so we have the intuitive judgments. We put forward the principles to explain the judgments, and if a judgment disagrees with a principle, we will adjust the principle so that it includes it. Something similar happens with science, where this would be like the data, right, what we observe. And this would be like a theory we put forward. And if a piece of data contradicts the theory, we have to adjust it to make room for the new data. And as I mentioned in passing, it can go the other way too, though. If a theory is really, really well established and there's a new piece of evidence that contradicts it, we may just assume that evidence was not collected properly. Like the example of faster than light travel, right? They observed neutrinos moving faster than the speed of light. That contradicts Einstein. Scientists just assumed that researchers made a mistake, which it turned out, in fact, they did. Yeah.
Could you talk about kin selection?
Yeah, so kin selection is just, so kin just means family. It's like an old-fashioned term for family. So the idea here is any genes that make you more likely to be nice to your family or increase your family's chances of spreading their genes, those genes can get selected for. So it's one way that niceness can evolve, at least niceness to relatives.
For the written question on uniqueness and plurality, I'd like us to choose an argument and then support evidence, evidence to support that argument.
So it will ask for two things, right? So two separate It could be separate theoretical or conceptual arguments, or it could be two different pieces of evidence. But they have to be kind of separate lines of argument or evidence. So it doesn't have to be argument and evidence. It could be just an argument, like a theoretical argument, or a study. Either way is fine. Yep.
Could you explain more about hedonism, please?
About what?
Hedonism.
Yeah, hedonism is, it comes from the word for pleasure. So there are different types of hedonism. So hedonistic egoism, like hedonistic psychological egoism, would be the view that we are motivated by selfishness, but more specifically, selfishness related to pleasure. So we're always motivated to get more pleasure for ourselves. You can also have ethical versions of hedonism. So, for example, standard versions of utilitarianism are hedonistic. Not in the psychological sense, but just they say that what's moral is to increase pleasure for everyone as much as possible. So hedonism there's lots of types, but it has to have something to do with pleasure, is what hedonism means. We'll see that in a chapter or two when we talk about Epicurus versus Aristotle. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Could you go over non sequitur?
Oh, non sequitur, yes. So non sequitur means does not follow. So it's a kind of fallacy. So if you have premises and then you have a conclusion, but the conclusion doesn't follow logically, that's a non sequitur. The context in which I brought that up was, people move from the uncontroversial premise, all voluntary action is motivated by desires, which is true, but they infer from that all voluntary action is motivated by selfish desires. And Feinberg argues that's a non sequitur. It doesn't logically follow. Yeah.
For the written question about arguments against egoism,
Yeah.
we need like multiple separate lines of argument also?
Yeah, so two different things. So, and as I said earlier, so it could be evidence. So look, if you wanted to be simple, you could cite two different studies from Batson. As long as it's two separate studies, that's fine. Or it can be, a conceptual argument from Feinberg and a study from Batson. Or you can also use the book. The book has different, and it doesn't have to be something I said in class. If you want to read the book really carefully and get something else out of it, that's fine. I've read the whole book, so I'll know it if I see it. Anything, so you have different options with there. You have the book, Feinberg, and the two Batson readings. I think I saw another hand. Yeah.
Would you say the is ought gap and ought implies can, those are both examples of non-sequiturs?
Ought implies can would be a sequitur. It does imply. So, but yes, ought implies is ought gap. Yes. If you violate that gap, then you've engaged in a non sequitur. Yes. Ought implies can. That one's more controversial. It's not a. You're kind of assuming that ought has something built into it, but yeah, the idea there is that if you say someone should do something, that implies that they are able to do it. But that one's somewhat more controversial. Yep.
Just to confirm, for moral nativists, they think
Yep.
that some of morality is innate, not like everything.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's anyone who thinks all of morality is innate. I mean, it would just be kind of insane. Like, how would you,
Okay.
cultures change over time, cultures are different between them, so. Yeah, moral nativism is just the view that some of it is innate.
Can you go over naturalistic fallacy?
Yeah, so naturalistic fallacy, somewhat similar to violating the is-ought gap. It's moving from X is natural to X is good. So this comes up in criticism of evolutionary psychology, and evolutionary psychologists, when they're thinking clearly, will use it as a defense against attacks. So, there's lots of examples. So you could point to some bad human behavior and tell a genetic story about why it's natural, but that does not imply that it's good. If you say this is natural, therefore it's good, then you're committing the naturalistic fallacy. Yeah, I mean, for easy example is tribalism, right? So we talked about how an in-group, out-group kind of bias You can tell a very plausible evolutionary story about why that's natural, but it does not follow that it's good. We may, through reflective equilibrium, decide, no, that's just a bad tendency we have. Who cares if it's natural? Okay, other questions? Yep.
Could you talk more about the first draft?
Yeah, that's a term that Haidt uses and the book uses. And someone has to send me an email about this. Some people think that the term innate means like fixed, like it's fixed by the genes, there's nothing you can do about it, and basically no one thinks that's right. The sense in which morality is innate, if it's innate at all, and you could argue it's not innate at all, but if it is innate, it's innate in the sense of it provides a first draft. Our genes, that is. Our genes give us a kind of general inclination in a certain direction, but it can be edited and or corrected by the environment in various ways. And of course, Haidt's view is that the 5 foundations are what's in the first draft. Yeah.
So we're talking about the nativist perspective that there's inborn morality. For there to be an inborn morality at like really young ages, when we're talking about like infants, what type of morality do we mean? Because it's not being expressed with words, right? Is it is morality just an emotional response of good or bad, like in this case?
Yeah, I mean, now I will say some people could object and say, and this wouldn't be, I wouldn't say it like this, but it doesn't count as morality at all unless it's full flown and they can articulate principles, full blown I should say. But you can think of the baby studies, right, where the babies at 6 to 10 months or so, even at that early stage, prefer the helping puppets, right, and prefer puppets that punish the hinderers. So you could think of that as a kind of proto-morality. They have enough built in to say, look, yeah, I like the nice ones, and I like the ones that are mean to the mean ones. So you could think of that as a kind of proto-morality that kids are born with. Yep.
Can you go over conceptual truth again?
Yeah, so a conceptual truth, and this is basically synonymous with an analytic statement in the Feinberg paper. A conceptual truth is one that's just true by definition. So classic example, all bachelors are unmarried, right? You don't need to do any empirical investigation or experimentation to find out that's true. Bachelor just means unmarried male. So it's just true by definition that all of them are unmarried. And arguably, something like all voluntary actions are caused by desires, arguably that's a truth of just definition. Because what does voluntary mean? It means you do something that you want to do. You're not coerced to do it. So just kind of true by definition that voluntary actions are caused by desires. An empirical truth is one that is true on the basis of evidence or observation. So you can't just think about it. You have to go and look. How many moons are orbiting Mars? You can sit on your armchair and think about the definitions as long as you want. You have to point the telescope. And also for psychological claims, right? So for claims about how the human mind works, those are empirical. And you've been spending a few years studying psychology, learning about how we test those claims, right? You do it with studies, brain scans, whatever. And what the book argues is that psychological egoism falls in this category. It's not true by definition. You have to provide evidence that all human motivations are selfish.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? All right, we can call it a day there. So good luck studying, and I will see you all on Monday for the test. Oh, the final question.
Sorry, can you just go over the entrenching hypothesis really quick?
Yeah, so the entrenching hypothesis, so there's 2 different hypotheses about how threat affects people's political attitudes. The conservative shift hypothesis and the entrenching hypothesis. The conservative shift hypothesis says threat makes people more conservative, whether they're liberal or conservative. It just makes them, it shifts them right. Entrenching says they become more strongly committed to whatever they already are committed to. So if they're conservative, they become more conservative. If they're liberal, they become more liberal. Okay. All right. So as I say, good luck, and I'll see you all on Monday.